Hello everyone, after quite a long break, we're back, hopefully. Just had my daughter's wedding we had a few months ago, and then I was quite ill, recovering from all the traveling and everything for quite a while. I lost my voice for about a month. And then, trying to get everything back in order, and we finally got a bit of time to do this lecture, which we've been working on for a while. So, judging by title, you can tell what it's about. It's another one of the proof lectures. We're going to speak about today the 10, well, how should we put this? The 10 miraculous, persistent miracles of Jewish history. Right? I haven't decided on the title yet, so you'll know the title better than me watching the video. The idea of this is that we're going to try proving God's existence, first of all, and also the divinity of the Torah and God's providence on the Jewish people as a third thing, I guess, as well. We're going to do this by bringing 10 anomalies in history, history, just like we mentioned this before, history has patterns. Yeah, everything in nature has a pattern. They follow patterns. They repeat themselves. We explained once the difference between nature and miracles, which are the two sides of the coin. Right? Miracles are things which do not repeat themselves. Right? They're things which go against the established order of things. Nature is the established order. The cause of nature seems to be the laws of nature. In Jewish thinking, it's one of God's names, called the name Elohim, which is the numerical value of Hateva, which means nature. Right? And from the Jewish point of view, you've got the other aspect of God's action is Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the Shem Havaya, the tetragrammaton, which means he was, is, will be, he transcends time, he's the master of everything. Right? And that's the idea that there's something beyond nature, whereas Elohim is God acting through nature. Yeah, that's the idea, and that's the difference between, from the Jewish point of view at least, between miracles and nature. But we're going to approach this from a rationalistic approach here, because it's meant to be a proof, and to prove things you can't have any assumptions based on your conclusions. So we can't use any Torah ideas or any presuppositions of a god or divinity or supernatural or anything like that. So we're going to work out based on core principles, like we do in many of our videos, based on just pure logic, rational thought, evidence, and we're going to come up with this conclusion. So there's 10 anomalies, there may be more, but I could identify 10 throughout Jewish history where we see that there is a certain order of things in the world, there's a nature, but when it comes to the Jewish people, Jewish history, you don't just get a slight deviation from the norm, you get a complete aberration. It becomes so radically different that we're gonna show that it's actually we're gonna show through logical thinking that it's actually more or less impossible, or it's not natural. Therefore, we can conclude that there's a supernatural hand involved. Okay. So we look at everything in the world. Science. It has its rules, right? Scientific method basically identifies patterns and gives them rules or suggested models. For example, you heat a metal, it expands. You hold an object, you drop it, it falls to the ground, right? So that always happens, right? It repeatedly happens. So that's a scientific rule. Things which are dropped or which don't have any other forces acting on them besides being on a planet or a big body, a big mass, they travel towards the center of gravity of that mass. That's how gravity works, right? So you drop something, it'll follow that rule, it'll travel down towards the earth, it'll fall down, basically, right? It fits in with that theory. right? But there are other rules as well. They don't have to be physical laws of nature. There are other laws of nature, things which repeat themselves, and we can get an idea of a pattern, right? You have economic laws of nature, like those. You have the Elliott wave, for example, in trading, or the Fibonacci sequence, Fibonacci golden ratio. If anyone's done day trading or things like that, there's certain patterns when something starts to increase in value on an upward trend. It goes up, then it goes down a bit, and then it goes up a much longer shooting up. Then it goes down a bit, and then has a shorter final fifth stage. For example. And then on the way down, it has a correction of three, sort of like down, a bit up, and then even more down. Right, so that's all the laws of supply and demand, or taxation. That kind of is called the something curve, right? The more you tax something, the less of it you have. People, if you tax food, people will try to save money and save and not buy food so much if they can, or if it's a luxury, you definitely see that people buy less of a luxury, the higher taxation. That's why they tax cigarettes and alcohol, because they don't want people to be drinking too much of it or smoking too much. So you tax that, goes down. It's a rule. It's based on a rule, and it's consistent. Within an individual, it might not be true. It could be a person might have a contrary sort of personality. Say, oh, they're going to tax alcohol. I'm going to show them I'm going to buy even more. We're not talking about that. We're talking about general trends and rules we see repeating themselves. So on the larger scale, the economic rule is the more you tax something, the less you get of it. The less people want to buy it. Supply and demand. The more supply you have of something, naturally the market will even out because there's more competition. And people are desperate to sell because there's so much supply and not as much demand as there was previously, so people put down the prices and things will be cheaper. And conversely, if there's more demand than supply, the higher the demand relative to supply will make things more expensive because people can see I can get more money for the same object. So these are economic laws or laws of psychology, right? Things like sociology, or things like the idea of there's lots of examples, or mass psychology, things like that. People reacting a certain way, people the normalcy bias, for example, going through that now in the West, where people should, if they were sensitive to what's going on, right? They see there's something going wrong with the Western countries. They're being taken over by immigrants at an astonishing rate. So what do? Well, quick, vote out the government which is letting this happen. But it happens very slowly. Why is that? Because people think, well, it's probably not as bad. Because look at the last 30, 40 years, it wasn't so bad. And it'll probably be something like that over the next 20 years as well. It's a bit worse. They don't understand that things can radically change. How did communism get in the early 20th century, right? Yeah, the kings and everything like that. There was a bubbling up of revolt, and then suddenly, within a relatively short time, it all changed, and the countries where Russia was changed radically, became Soviet. This happens everywhere. So that's a psychology, yeah. People let these things happen because of a mass psychological phenomenon called normalcy bias. People, when they see things about to go wrong, they'll rationalize and say it's probably not going on until it's too late. The famous metaphor of the frog. You've got a frog which you put in water, cold water, you turn on the heat, the water starts to boil and it starts to cook the frog. But because it's only increasing temperature bit by bit, the frog doesn't realize that actually something serious is going on. If you put him into the boiling water, then it will say, wow, I was cold before, now I'm boiling hot, jump out. Because it happens gradually, it dies before it realizes it's in trouble. right? These are rules in psychology. There are also rules in history as well. Yeah, it's connected with human psychology as well, but it's more complicated than that, because it's how different nations interact and how nations on the inside, how they develop, how they're structured, how they correspond to opposing nations or friendly nations. There's patterns to them, right? There's rules of nature within history. So the way we're defining nature here is something which we recognize as a pattern, something which repeats, right? We're just making an observation, really. Yeah, science, for example, it doesn't say, we're saying that when you drop something, it drops to the ground. We're not saying that baselessly. We're observing nature, well, the world around us. I shouldn't use the word nature in this, as part of the definition. We look at the world around us, our environment. Whenever someone drops something, or whenever something doesn't have something underneath it, unless there's an upward force like a bird flying or something, right, it'll fall to the ground. So it always happens. You drop something, it always falls to the ground, right? And if it doesn't, then there's another rule which is overriding it, like magnetism, right? So if you've got a magnet here, you drop something, instead of going to the ground, if it's a powerful enough magnet, it will actually go up. But that's because there's another force, right? And you can actually show how they work with the mathematics. When how close to the magnet has to be, the inverse square rule. I think that's how it works with magnets, and gravity is a different rule. It's just a constant acceleration. All right. Anyway, enough of mathematics. So the mathematics watching this video are going to be happy with all that scientific and mathematical stuff there, right? The idea is that nature repeats itself. The repetition itself tells you it's natural, right? Right? And from the atheist point of view, how do they look at it? Because nature itself is reality. There's nothing beyond nature. Reality is defined by the laws of nature. So everything has to have repetition. Patterns have to repeat. If they don't, then you have to find alternative explanation, right? But if we've got an exhaustive observation of human history, we see this happening over and over and over again, then you have to say there's a new rule. There's a new rule which we don't know about, right? That's either going to be a new natural law, but if it's natural, it's going to be very hard to say why. We're going to see in the examples. How can you say something is natural if it literally only happens in a specific circumstance? Or it's supernatural. That's the idea. Supernatural meaning something which is above nature. Which you can hear that we're going to say that we're going to connect that to God. Okay. So it's just as a taster. Let's look at some of the examples, and then we'll go through each example methodically. Yeah. It's very strange. Jewish people throughout history, right? We already gave a lecture on anti-Semitism. Very strange way a nation develops and persists throughout history. Usually nations are big, they've got power, they've got land, things like that. And when they fall, it's because they lose all those things. And then the name of the nation usually disappears. But yet, look at the Jewish people. They haven't just disappeared despite everything going on. We can go into detail in a minute. We've actually thrived despite all the antagonism against us, the persecutions, and somehow we've thrived through history. We'll see, is that a natural thing or a supernatural thing? That's the question. Yeah, we're a tiny percentage of the world population, but we have a completely overinflated, overrepresented influence on the world stage, whether politically, scientifically, culturally, in public awareness. Incredible. So we'll see. We'll break it down. We'll use our rigorous methods that we like to use. Okay, so Example number one. A nation has certain elements to make it be a nation, right? Take any country in the world, anything which you'd call a nation, it will have, this is what the experts basically boil it down to. They need a shared land, right? So living in the same land, that's the starting point, right? Shared government and language. If you have competing governments within the same land, then you've basically got a civil war, right? One of them is going to win, or they're going to be a state of conflict. That's not what you call a nation. That's really two nations. You've got different languages. I'm not talking about multilingual society. I'm talking about where some section of society, they don't speak that language anymore, right? Then you get a break within the nation, right? Like it's happening in the West quite a lot at the moment. Many people don't speak English, and they fail to assimilate, and they make their own enclaves of their own little mini societies, right? But a nation, in order to persist, it needs to have either, or ideally all three: a language, a land, and a government, right? And if it doesn't have any of them, what's making them a nation anymore, right? So, for example, Carthage, an ancient tribe or country, right? It was Carthage, I think in North Africa. Originally, they originated from Rome and they broke away. I think it was North Africa. I can't remember off the top of my head, right? It was a major civilization, right? As a rival of Rome, and actually one of the very few times that Rome got defeated was by Carthage, with Hannibal and the elephants coming over the mountain when they didn't expect it, right? But what happened? They got conquered. Their land got conquered. They got absorbed into the surrounding empires. There's no recognizable Carthaginian empire anymore. You just don't have it, right? For the last 2,000 years, you've got descendants of the Carthaginians, unless they were exterminated, but they're now part of the Roman Empire. They're part of this, right? Part of whatever North African empire. Some of them people went here, but they've lost their identity. The identity of a nation can't persist without at least having a land or a language to unify the people, or a government, or ideology, I guess, comes with government, right? Look at ancient history, right? The Philistines, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Hittites, right? All countries in the Middle East, right? These are major countries, and they're just gone, right? You could add on even ancient Egypt. Doesn't really have the same culture anymore, right? It's connected to the same place geographically, so it's called Egypt, and they have pride in the ancient civilization. But you can't really say that the ancient Egypt civilization has persisted into modern Egypt. They're very, very different fundamentally. So when we have a look at the Jewish people, for example, what have they had over the last couple of thousand years since the Roman exile in the year 70 CE? Right? They've lost sovereignty. They don't have a Jewish king or government. We're not talking about modern Israel. We're talking about the original country, right? King Solomon and all the lineage of kings has gone. They went into exile. They came back shortly after, but they had a different system there. They had a system of religious leaders as opposed to kings, of princes, right? Which are more like presidents, I guess you'd call it, right? They lost their homeland after that exile. They lost the sovereignty. We don't have a common Jewish government for the last 2,000 years. On the contrary, we've been part of other countries' governments, right? And we don't have language. Yeah, the Jewish language was stopped, Aramaic or Hebrew, whatever they spoke at the time, Jews basically stopped speaking those languages altogether. They spoke German, they spoke Arabic, Spanish, whatever country they ended up in, the Jews were not unified by any language anymore, or any government. They're unified by the ideology, but you're going to see, is ideology good enough? Right? Think of another example where you have a country or a people where they get totally dispersed, they're speaking different languages, they don't have the same land, and their ideology connects them together. And with the Jewish people, it's even harder to say that, because a massive percentage of the Jewish people have not adhered to our ideology of the Torah, right, throughout the generations. Yeah, the core has, but that's not something which normally happens. You might get some religions, so it should become a religion, so the Jewish religion, like the other major religions. But you don't get a nationhood. You don't get the nation of Christians or Muslims. There's no such thing as a nation of them, right? You don't get the nation of Buddhism, of Buddhists. That's not a nation. It's a religion. It's something else. I have a Jewish nation, a group of people who call themselves one people, a family, a big family, which is all connected somehow. That you can't have. Okay, something to think about there, right? But yeah, 2,000 years later, we're still recognized. Before the establishment of the State of Israel, everyone knew what Jew is. Medieval age, Jews. I'm a Jew. I'm distinct from my surrounding non-Jewish neighbors. Even though I'm living in this country or this region for thousands of years now, I'm a Jew, right? I'm part of the Jewish nation. You're part of, you're English, no, you're German, you're Moroccan. No, I'm Jewish. So we see that we're part of a Jewish nation, despite the fact that the normal things which define the nation are not there. Right? Right. So instead of the conditions that erased other ancient nations, not only did it not erase the Jews, they became the conditions through which Jewish survival is demonstrated. You can see Jewish survival through the adversity. Amazing. Okay, that's the first one. So it's the idea of the survival of the nation in the first place. The Jewish people naturally, if you follow all the natural laws, all the repeating examples which we have through our ancient nations, when they lose their land because they're conquered, or they lose their government, like with the Soviets, the Russians and the Soviets became radically different form of government, or they lose their language, right? They cease to be that nation. But yet the Jewish people didn't need any of it. No, we're still Jewish. We're the same Jews that we were 3,500 years ago. Exactly the same. We're the same people. We haven't changed. Oh, we don't have a nation. We don't have a land. We don't have a common language, government. Doesn't matter. We're Jews. You don't have that with any other nation. It's a subtle one, that one. But if you think about it, think about any other example, right? Someone mentioned to me the Gypsies, the Romani community, or whatever, I think. Yeah, there are many different types of Gypsies, and they basically got different flavors based on where they ended up, and you can't really call them they don't call themselves a nation. They're traveling sort of nomadic little groups. You can have that, but there's nothing which unifies like the Gypsies in one like country in Western Europe and Eastern Europe. They've just got nothing. They've got more in common with the countries which they're in over the name Gypsy, right? right? It's like you have like a certain races you can have within different countries. They mention like in America, you've got African Americans, Asian Americans. Yeah, they're Americans now. Yeah, they just have to be a different color, have a different history, but they're American now. Yeah, the Jewish people are just Jewish. They're not English Jewish, American Jewish. They've got different cultural things, but their identification is one of a Jew. Okay, the second one, the size of the Jewish people. So if you look at throughout history, if you look at the trends of populations, they grow, right? The world obviously starts off with very few people, and expanded, and you had countries, and each country grew unless it was conquered and wiped out and people were killed, right? Then they have to hope there was enough surviving, they can rebuild their country. So usually a continual increase of the population happens in any country, any nation, right? You don't, if it doesn't succeed in growing, then the neighbors which are growing will eventually envelop them, and you end up with like a tiny country of a few thousand people with a massive millions of people country next to it. Eventually, the small country will be absorbed into the bigger one, at least culturally, right? The country generally, or nation generally, increases its population if it's successful, or if it's unsuccessful, it will be conquered and eventually vanquished and assimilate into the neighboring culture, right? So one of those two things will happen. So generally, small countries generally get absorbed into the bigger ones. You have many examples, though. I have to say that I think this in itself is not good proof, as there are many small countries in the world which have just been left alone. Fine, not a problem, right? But they started small and they've increased on a small level. So they might have started with 1,000 people, and after many centuries, there are 5,000 people. A bigger nation started off with about 1,000 years ago, it might have been 100,000. Now it's about 20 million or something like that. So basically, things grow at a certain rate, right? Some faster than others. The Jewish people is very, very strange. After thousands of years of continuous existence, the Jewish people are still about 15 million people. We've just about got back to the numbers of Jewish people from before the Holocaust, right? And this has been happening throughout history, right? We're always well, we used to be a big nation in the land of Israel, right? But we increased, persecuted, killed. This country had a lot of people killed, pogroms, holocausts, right? High birth rate. It's not as if there's a natural explanation that Jews generally have 3 children on average, right? Or 2.5, whatever it is, the replacement ratio, right? For a nation to have the same population, you need at least 2.1 children. So, like a man and a woman have a boy and a girl as a child, so right, and they have, and the boy gets obviously not to the sister but to another girl, and the girl gets married to a different boy, and they have 2 children as well. So the population stays static, and it's 2.1, I think, because you have to take into account people dying or not having children and things like that. But on average, to keep a population stable, you need 2.1 children. The Jewish people didn't have that. They always had many children. Very, especially from the Torah perspective, we're meant to have many children, but yet somehow our population didn't grow. So what's the explanation? Well, it grew, we got killed. It grew, killed, grew, killed. So we're getting killed over and over again. But it was always never enough to extinguish us. Right? The Romans come, they massacre us. Fine. Okay. The Greeks, Persians, right? All different people trying to conquer us. The Spanish, the Crusades, yeah, the Cossacks, right? Khmelnytsky massacres in the 1600s were astonishing. About half of, it's even worse proportionally than the Holocaust. Half of European Jewry got annihilated in the 1600s. In terms of numbers, it wasn't as bad as the Holocaust, but in terms of proportion, it was. Right? Yet we still staying the same sort of small nation. Right? If you compare us to China, for example, the Jewish nation and the Chinese nation started around the same time. The Chinese are in the billions. Well, there's a dispute about that now. Yeah, it could be they're fluffing up their numbers to make themselves look bigger than they actually are. But they're definitely in the hundreds of millions at least. Right? Because they had the one-child policy for a long time. That would be disastrous to any nation maintaining its population. The Jewish people, if you look up, I've seen it side by side. There's an estimate of the Jewish, the Chinese, and it goes something like this, right? The population throughout the centuries. The Jewish people are literally something more like that. We've increased, but at a very, very slow rate, right? And as I said, until the Holocaust, we were 15 million, and we're still that now. Okay. So on one hand, it seems we're striking a perfect balance. We're never able to grow into a nation where we can be resilient in terms of our number and just resist attacks, because we've been dispersed amongst the nations. We kept getting killed in every nation we've been to. Listen to the anti-Semitism lecture we gave a while back. But yeah, it was never enough to wipe us out, but it was enough to stop us growing. Very strange. Yeah. Some countries were successful. They didn't have much resistance like the Chinese, so they just grew and grew and grew. Some nations were constantly in war with the neighbors, so they grew at a slower rate, but they grew. The Jewish people hardly grow at all, and they're getting killed the whole time, and yet we still somehow exist as a small nation, right? Right, so now, talking about this is a third point now. Connected with what we said before, but it's a different observation. To survive in exile, so the Jewish people are in exile, fine. To survive that, yeah, you need the nation to be together at least, okay? You think, okay, and then maybe one day we'll get our country back, we'll get our government back, right? Usually this will be the language as well as connected with language. People are together, they'll speak the same language. For example, you have different enclaves of different people from who moved to a different country, but they maintain their identity, right? Not as a nation, but as a group who's basically still connected with their homeland somehow, right? So, for example, if you look at, I think there's a different places in America, like in California, there's a big Armenian community there. Can't think of another example. People tend, when they go out of a certain country, they tend to cluster, or or the Somalians in Michigan. I think it's Michigan, is it? Or Minnesota. There's a massive Somalian community there. It's been in the news recently. So they tend to keep their identity by the fact that they don't just go all over the place. They tend to sort of cluster in certain areas, so at least the vestiges of the original culture they can keep going, sort of, right? It makes it much harder, but it's still possible, right? They've got the same language at least. They don't have the land or the government, at least we've got the same language, right? Same history, whatever. But if you scatter people throughout the whole world, that doesn't happen. You don't get any homogeneous communities by doing that, usually, right? It can happen, but if you take any other country where you've got a big exodus from that country and you can still identify the people by that country, they'll have to stay clustered together. The Jewish people are not like that, not through choice, but we're literally scattered across the whole world. We've got in Arabic countries, in Yemen, right, Poland, Germany, France, Spain, North Africa, Morocco, Persia, even South Africa, Persia, Iraq, right? They all took on their own languages. There was the language of the country at the time where they were living there, or you had Jewish versions of it, like there's a Jewish Arabic, Yiddish in the European countries, Ladino in the Spanish countries, right? You had the Jewish Persian, right? Right? So, despite the fact that they've been totally separate, right, and taken on new cultures, new languages, they still have a recognizable identity, right? Everything about their culture changes. Different types of clothes, they wore different clothes. You look at Jews in Africa and in Europe, dress very differently, right? The food is different, right? Accents, even the customs within Judaism change, right? The customs, not the laws, though. Still got that one calendar, the same festivals, the same laws, right? And the same remembered homeland, land of Israel, which we're yearning to go back to. You don't have, if this was a natural thing to happen, you'd see it repeated in other nations. You don't see that. When people leave a nation, either through exile or optionally, yeah, you don't see this scattering everywhere. There's just people randomly going to different places, and yet refusing to fully assimilate and lose their identity in the new places, right? They either lose their identity or they find a way of quickly going back before they lose their identity, or they make small enclaves, right? So mini cities within cities, like Chinatown sort of thing, right? You don't get that with a nation which is completely spread out, spread thin. Remember, the population of the Jewish people in the first place is not great. So when they're spread out, you're talking about these enclaves are tiny compared to the surrounding population. You're usually about 1%, if you're lucky, of a population. In England, I think the Jewish people are about, how much is it? About less than 0.5% of the population, right? And that's one of the top 10 countries for Jews in the world, with less than 0.5%. Even in America, I think it's only about 2 or 3% or something like that. Was it 5 million in? It was 5 million in 300 million a while ago. It's about more like 350 million. So it's 5 in. Yes, it's barely 1.5%. If I worked out correctly. 5 million, 500 million. Yeah, that'll be 1%. Yeah, it's wow, it's much less. Oh no, so it's more. It's about 2%, something like that. It's about between 1 and 2%. Even in America, that's a tiny percentage, right? For an area or for a country within a nation within another nation. Okay. And remember, Nowadays, it's much easier to maintain different connections between different countries, between different parts of a nation which got dispersed, because we have communication now. Remember, until 100 years ago, you didn't have such a thing as global communication, barely, right? Even global travel you didn't have. So we're talking about countries which have lost connection for 2,000 years, yet they maintain their identity really well, so much so when they reunite with each other, they understand what they're doing totally. You don't have this in other nations at all. Okay. Also, we've got point number 4 now, is the consistency of our texts, right? So how do you transmit important fundamental texts of a nation or a religion? Until the printing press for a few hundred years ago, you had to take the book, get a scribe, he reads what's in the original book, and he transcribes it. He writes it down physically on a new book, and you do that over again. If you want to mass produce it, you have to have hundreds of scribes. That's how you do it. So naturally, when people write something out over and over again, eventually you get small errors coming in. You miss out a word, or you might write the same word on the end of a line at the beginning of the next one, like an optical illusion there, right? You might miss out a letter. You might miss out a whole line if the beginning of the two lines starts with the same word, right? Even in the Talmud, you have that. You have sometimes you have a whole sentence which has to be added in again, because the sentence doesn't make sense, because the scribes saw one word here, right, and im, right? Okay, write it down. Then where was the word im, which means if? He looks at, oh, right, im, and he writes it down. Doesn't realize he should have done the previous line, which has also got the same word. So mistakes do creep in. And remember, especially people doing it fast, because you want to get copies out fast, you get mistakes. And this is exactly what you see in manuscripts throughout the ages, right? Even in religions and countries which have got massive resources, like the Christian religion, like with the New Testament, for example, right? There are many variations of the New Testament itself. You have loads of variants and many variants which completely change the meaning of the context you have in the New Testament and Christian writings. But that's normal for human transmission, normal handwritten transmission. That causes rifts between interpretations of things like that, right? It's like the telephone game, but over centuries, right? Across continents, right? Different languages, right? Right? Because eventually, you have to write a Torah in an English country, right? Where the natural language is not Hebrew, and it's not. They have to be loyal to the original language, and you have to check the manuscripts to make sure they line up. So there's always going to be a bit of erring, and then after many copies, you get vastly different versions of the same thing. And this even happens in our Talmud, as we mentioned. If you go through a page of Talmud, you see usually on average about 4 or 5 places where there's a word missing or a few words missing, right? And they have to compare it with other manuscripts, and they put the more precise text back in, as a note on the side, right? And the Talmud, for example, is only a couple of thousand years old. It's less than that. It's about 1,700 years old. But yet, when it comes to the Torah, the Tanakh, the Masoretic text, it's called, right? The 5 books of Moses, let's say, they're virtually wherever you go in the world. This is astonishing. We found this out recently when the Yemenites reintegrated, the Yemenite Jews reintegrated with the rest of the Jewish populace after being separated for 2,500 years. Right? The texts, which are something like a few 100,000 letters, are basically letter for letter perfectly identical. That's incredible. There's no other text which does that, and definitely not with the sort of historical persecutions that Jewish people have had. They've had other things to worry about besides making sure their texts are being consistent. They had to worry about survival, right? There are a couple of differences between the Yemenite text and the rest of the world's one. A couple of letters we're talking about which don't make a difference. Even in the reading of it, it sounds the same. It's like an aleph and a hey. There was one difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Torah scrolls. It was the word dako, which you can spell Dalet Kaf Aleph or Dalet Kaf Hey. Right? It means exactly the same thing, and you see that word itself in different forms. Sometimes it takes a Hey, sometimes it takes an Aleph. So the difference, there's basically no difference in the meaning at all. That's probably so insignificant, it crept in though. Right? Compare that with other religions which have much more power and resources to maintain the text. That's not what normally happens. Even a powerful nation, there will be mistakes creeping in if you don't have like a photocopier or printing press, where you're printing the same thing over and over. You will get mistakes and you will get inaccuracies. So how on earth the Jewish text of the Torah and the Nevi'im, more or less, and the Nevi'im is also very impressive. The prophets, not the 5 books, the other books as well, also astonishingly accurate as well. I think there are more inaccuracies or variations there, but very, very small and almost never changing the basic meaning. How do you do that? Yeah, and that's not really the question. The question is not how do they manage to do it. Is that nature tells us this thing doesn't happen. This is not the tendency of transmission of texts to end up with such a phenomenon. When people write out texts and they rewrite them and copy them, there will be mistakes. That's natural. It's a law of nature. Yeah, to do with the fallibility of people's concentration, whatever reason you want to give. Forget about the reason. Just look at the phenomenon. It repeats itself over and over again. Yeah, texts have variants, and over time the variants get more varied and more versions until you end up like with the New Testament, at least thousands of versions of it. Right? Yeah, that is the idea here. But yet the Torah is consistent. How does that happen? There's a rational reason for it. Yeah, it's because the Jewish people, with conviction, believe how important every letter of the Torah is, right? But yet, if it's natural for any religion to take their religion seriously and their text to be sacrosanct, that they should put maximum effort to make sure there's no mistakes creeping in, then you should get this in other religions, other nations where their most exalted texts, right, don't get corrupted in any way. So looking at light for light, it doesn't follow the pattern. It's not natural. Naturally, however much conviction a person has in their religion, mistakes will happen. But Judaism not. Thousands of years. We've had this Torah for almost 3,500 years. And no matter who wrote it, right, whether they're both in the land of Israel at the time, whether they're in 2 different opposite ends of the world, separated by thousands of years, right, of exile, compare them, exactly the same. Amazing. Okay, the 5th example. What happens when a country is conquered? When a country is conquered, they want to survive, right? So individuals think, okay, all right, that didn't go well. How are we going to survive under the power of this new power now? Yeah, they're going to kill us, persecute us. Let's just be nice. Let's try assimilating into society. Let's become German. Let's become Italian. right? Let's throw everything away, right? And we can have our customs, whatever, right? Right? If they're defeated, the nation which is conquered has to live within the culture of the conquerors, right? And usually the victorious culture, a victorious country is much more powerful, more advanced, more sophisticated, has more benefits than the conquered one. Because usually military power goes with scientific, ingenuity as well, right? And everything else is nicer as well. Like the culture is nicer because things are more advanced. So generally, people want to assimilate into a more powerful, more mainstream, more advanced culture, right? When Alexander conquered many countries, yeah, or the Romans, they conquered different countries. The defeated countries learnt to dress, speak, think, and even worship their deities, yeah, or the philosophy of the conquering culture. Or the English, for example, the British Empire, when they went to certain countries which were very, very primitive at the time, archaic and very, very, very brutal. Well, sort of like a culture. Like for example, in India, they used to, when the husband died, the wife, the widow, they used to burn her alive or something like that. I can't remember the details. That was normal. Yeah, it knows that they're together in heaven or whatever, or they get reincarnated together. I don't know the details, but that's one of the things they used to do. Yeah, or human sacrifice, things like that. Yeah, there's no sewage system, things like this, right? Or haphazard government, whatever, right? Democracy. So when Britain conquered these countries, they took on these positive things which the British brought to them, right? They're more sophisticated, more civilized. That's generally what happens. So the Romans, they conquered the land of Israel, the Jewish people, Judea. They destroyed the temple. They suppressed any revolts or anything like that, right? And any survivors either were subjugated under the Roman rule or they just got dispersed out of the country completely, right? So Rome basically defeated the Jews. But did they go and say, okay, fine, you won. Okay, let's assimilate with this culture. At least we'll have a nice life. No. Christianity, Rome, Western civilization, which all followed each other, right? Not only did the Jews not change their beliefs just to fit in with those civilizations, the opposite happened. This is incredible. Instead of assimilating to the Roman ideologies, like any other conquered nation would, the opposite happened. The Roman nation started to adopt Jewish values, starting with Christianity, taking off, so there's this small sect of, in the time of just a few years before decades before the destruction of the temple, you had the story of Jesus and his apostles, right? And that complicated the evolution of the Christian religion until finally, as opposed to being a relatively small, sort of religion which was based originally on Judaism, right? Even though it got severely changed along the way, the Roman Empire decided, actually, let's make this our religion for the whole empire. Wow, right? The same thing happened with Islam as well, right? And all the Arabs, they were just pagans serving idolatry, whatever. And then one person comes along and he says, No, believe in one God, right? And believe in the Torah, and also they believe in the New Testament, and they're the prophets now. Where on earth did that come from? You're talking about like an Arab, right? Muhammad, who could have chosen any direction for his country, but he chooses monotheism, but the Jewish version, right? With obviously their own flavor, changing some of the fundamentals. Yeah, and the Jewish people were a tiny population in Arabia, tiny, but yet they adopted this small group here. Ooh, this one. Imagine. Let's just bring it as an example. Imagine what's a small country with a religion. Okay, imagine they conquered the country of Nepal or something like that, right? Right, and then the Nepalese go into exile, and they take their traditions of, I don't know what they do. The Buddhism, is it? Right, and then they practice Buddhism, and the reigning countries, oh, this Buddhism is just stupid. This we are Muslims or we're Christians, whatever, right? Right, and they abandon their religion for this small conquered, low down trodden nation which they conquered themselves. So, well, actually, your ideas are better than our ones. Let's get rid of it. Forget about the Roman gods, the Greek gods, right? Paganism. Let's do monotheism. Obviously, Christianity is complicated because it's got a lot of the relics of idolatry and paganism from time of the Greeks, but officially they call themselves monotheists. Why is that? Right? John Adams, I think he's one of the presidents of the United States. Yeah. He said the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. It's a recognition from a famous, powerful philosopher, right? President, right? They recognize the Jewish people have changed society. The Judeo-Christian values, as they're called now, right? So you could say Rome won the war, but Jerusalem won the argument, right? But this doesn't happen with any other nation. You don't have this phenomenon happening ever in history where a small nation gets conquered. Normally they're doing whatever they can to suck up to their victors, right? And just try assimilating with that nation. Instead, the Jewish people say, no, we're keeping what we're keeping. And they don't get wiped out because they're rebellious against the predominant culture. The predominant culture comes around to their way of thinking. Amazing. Very strange. Right? Again, something which doesn't follow a pattern. That's not how things work naturally. So let's recap the 5 things we've spoken about so far, and then we'll hopefully go a bit quicker through the last 5. Okay. Right, the first one is a nation, to keep its identity, needs 3 things. It needs a country, language, and a government, right? If it loses one, and definitely if it loses all 3, it loses its identity. But yet the Jewish people didn't, right? And if you're going to say it's because of the Torah, right? So you're basically saying, oh, a book with an ideology, so other countries should have survived based on their ideology, right? We don't see that. So therefore, this is an anomaly, right? The pattern of growth amongst nations is they start off small, like going back a few thousand years, every country was relatively small, with 10,000 people, maybe 50,000, and each one grows, expands, fills in the countries until you get big countries, right, with millions of citizens, right? Right? As we showed, the Chinese grew at the same time it started, as Jewish nation started with, I can't remember how much, it grew, and it became over 1 billion people at one stage, if not now even. And that's despite the one child policy, which Mao instituted in the 1900s, which severely limited the population growth of the Chinese. But yet the Jewish people, we expanded at a much slower rate, right? And if you say, well, it's because they were persecuted, and persecuted nations don't grow so fast. Yeah, but you know what happens otherwise? If a nation gets persecuted and conquered over and over again and killed, eventually they just assimilate into the society. But yet the Jewish people kept that perfect balance of not going too small and not dwindling until they're almost extinct, right? They didn't assimilate, but they didn't grow at the same time, right? 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 The third one is that when we were exiled, we weren't specifically in one or two different areas. Okay, we're in exile, we'll keep things going by our pseudo governments or our pseudo cultures in certain places. Even though the Jewish people did do that. But the difference is, when they go to different cultures, they tend to stay with each other, and the fact that they're together keeps the memory of the original nation going. But that happens in one country, right? You don't get happening in 2, 3, 5, 100 different countries. That doesn't happen. Once you get 100 different countries, the Jews in one country will eventually lose everything and completely assimilate, right? But the Jewish people, despite being dispersed over the whole world, not just one or two countries, the whole world, which is really strange, that itself is an anomaly. Where you have any country which is conquered and the people get dispersed over the whole world, right, and still maintain their identity. Yeah, they'll be expelled. Okay, let's go into this country. We'll build a community within this other country, but over the whole world, unheard of. And also keeping their culture and their ideology intact. And then the consistency of the texts. Somehow the Jewish copiers, the Jewish scribes, did a supernaturally almost greater job than any other scribe in history or set of scribes of history or any ideology, copying with immense accuracy the 5 books of Moses, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? The Masoretic text, right? With literally one variation until the Yemenites came along, and the Yemenites had their own version, which was about maximum 5 or 6 different variations, I think, and none of them make any difference, right? So it's about 2,500 years, 2 different control groups, and they end up basically with identical versions, not the thousands of differences which you have in other big books like the New Testament, despite being much smaller. Right, so there's less words to make a mistake on in the first place. So the fact that they preserved their books, their scriptures with such accuracy, you'd expect that to follow some sort of pattern. But literally in this case, there is no other example where they maintained the accuracy of a text, as far as I know. Someone in the comments can tell me otherwise, where the accuracy of the text was maintained, right, without variation, for thousands of years. And the 5th example we've just done is the idea that a conquered nation doesn't change the conqueror's mind to adopting the conquered nation. Usually a country conquers another nation because our idea, we hold the world should be like this, right? You're very primitive, very uncivilized, we're beating you, right? We don't want you, we want you to come to our side. And yet the opposite happens. The non-Jewish nations assimilate to the Jewish nation, amazingly. Then we have anti-Semitism. We won't spend long on this because we gave a whole big lecture about it. So group hatred normally attaches itself to some recognizable effect. There's a pattern, it's either over land, resources, war, class, religion, race, or immigration. When people are immigrating in another country, there's a hatred to them sometimes, right? When the conflict changes, the reason of the hatred goes, so therefore the hatred goes, right? Or they move to a new target, right? There's a rationale for this, because why does one nation hate another one? There has to have a rational reason. There has to be a story behind it. So when that reason disappears, it makes sense that the hatred would disappear. Maybe there's a relic of it, there's a remnant of it. Oh, we hate the Irish because I'm not sure why we hate the Irish in England. Is it because of the IRA and stuff like that, the bombs? Is it because of the conquest in the 1800s? Right? There's some animosity there, right? But it doesn't have the same intensity anymore. Okay, Irish, get on with the Irish, they're okay, right? No one really cares anymore about the Irish in terms of, oh, we're English, Irish. It's more of like a sort of like a showmanship, sort of. We're the English, you Irish. Yeah, it's more like a playful banter, sort of. It can be a bit more serious, but it's not a deep hatred of the Irish people, right? Or the Irish people when they went to America. Yeah, they said, these Irish are dangerous, they're whatever, right? They integrated, and now they're just Americans. Yeah, you got, what are you, Italian American, Irish American? No, people don't hate Irish Americans now. They might do it playfully, like you might hate someone who supports a different football team, right? But it's not an animosity of existential hatred. However, the Jew is hated for within different countries all over the world for completely different reasons, right? Sometimes it's because they keep their own enclaves, right? These Jewish people, they don't want to assimilate with us. Okay, so it's normal for countries. You have to say there's a natural thing that countries hate anyone who doesn't want to assimilate. That implies that people who do want to assimilate will be fine. But yet, the Jewish people, they assimilated too well into our society. Make your mind up, right? What is it? Are the Jewish people an isolated, insular community, and that's why people hate Jews, because they keep themselves to themselves, or they hated because they assimilate too much and they're too present in the dominant culture? Which one is it? You do have countries which hate a minority which keeps itself to itself, but when they assimilate, they're usually welcomed and they're happy with it. But yeah, the Jewish people, whatever they do, that's a new reason to hate them. It's like that. The reason to hate the Jews is just because they're Jews, not because of any rational reason, right? You don't have this in any other nation. We hate the Chinese, the Muslims. Why? Just because they're Muslims, just because they're Arab, just because they're Chinese. There's no such thing. Why? Well, for example, they might hate the Chinese is because I don't know example of people hating the Chinese necessarily. Well, because they're trying to bring communism in. Okay, so it's ideological. The Chinese show themselves to be upstanding American citizens, for example, then people won't hate the Chinese at all. Or same with the Muslims, because they're trying to take over with their laws and everything. But if they show that they're assimilating into the culture, they can keep their religion as long as they're not doing it in a dominant way. They're scaring people. People won't have a problem with it, right? But yeah, with the Jewish people, whatever the reason is, you have opposite reasons, and yet they're still hated. Are they too poor, the Jewish people? They're poverty stricken, they're low down, they're low lives. Look how poor they are. Yeah, God must have rejected them or whatever. But yet in other countries, they're too rich, right? Or they're capitalist in a communist country, or too capitalist or too communist, right? Right? or they're weak, they're downtrodden, or they've got secret power, whatever. They don't have any country, right? You countryless people, yeah? But when we do get a country, we hate you for having the country, right? The allegations contradict each other. So each one in isolation is a reasonable reason. But you can't have constantly opposite reasons, not just, even if it wasn't opposite reasons, just different reasons for the same nation, right? If you've had the Japanese, right? In one country, they're hated for being rich. One country, they're hated for being the too isolated and keeping to their own communities, right? That would also be strange. Generally, when a country assimilates into another country, that's one of two things. It assimilates nicely and people are happy with that, or it keeps themselves to themselves and they're either left alone, like the Amish, right, in America, or they're seen as, they're building up their own enclave and they're trying to build a country, a state within a state. Right? That makes sense. There's a logic to that. However, so if, let's say, the Japanese had a tendency that we like to go around asserting our influence everywhere and forcing people to think like us, it wouldn't make sense that the same Japanese people in one country where that's a problem, the cause of their anti-Japanists, that's a new word, right? To go to another country and be accused of, we don't like the Japanese because they don't show their culture to us so much. They just keep it to themselves. That doesn't make sense. It's going against their nature. If there is such a thing as the nature of a country or a people to act in a certain way, which might cause strife with the hosting country or with the neighboring country, right? Why would that happen? Doesn't make sense. That doesn't follow a pattern. The pattern is, right? There's a reason to hate a people, and once the reason goes, the hatred goes. But yet, when Jewish people, whether it's the same country, and a new type of anti-Semitism happens later on within the same country, or it's a completely different country, the anti-Semitism's got completely different reasons in different places. Wow. Doesn't follow any patterns. That's not how nature works in terms of hatred of people. Separate or assimilated, capitalist, communist, weak or powerful, rootless, right, or nationalist, right? Amazing. So it seems that if you want to give a look at it from just jumping out of our more scientific way of looking at it and looking at the repetition, yeah, nations have one, maximum two reasons why people hate them, yeah, and never two opposing reasons. It seems to be that's a real thing we're trying to emphasize here. However, when it comes, if you want to look at it in terms of intuition, it seems to be that anti-Semitism doesn't start with the Jews like a reason. It starts with the Jews themselves. The people hate the Jews for who they are, not what they're doing or how they're acting. The mere existence of Jews causes certain people to hate Jews, and then they think up the reason afterwards. Okay. Number 7, the land, right? So if you have a look at different countries, some countries are naturally more fertile, like Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, as it's called. You've got fertile lands, right? And it doesn't matter, or if you have arid lands or infertile lands which don't grow so well, right? But you don't have such a thing as a land where depending who the inhabitants are, it's either desolate or it's fertile. Because anyone who goes to a land will find a way of making the land grow and flourish, unless the land itself had bad soil and it wouldn't work, right? So, for example, the Nile Valley, right? It's agriculturally important under radically different dynasties. Ancient Egypt is a very place of abundance then, and conquerors changed, but people still want to cultivate the land, and they succeeded in Egypt, right? Because the system of irrigation there, or whatever, yeah, the land was ripe for flourishing. But yet the land of Israel, yeah, changed hands between different nations. Ottomans, you had the Romans, you had the Arabs, Crusaders, right? Over the last few thousand years, right? There's massive underdevelopment, degradation. The ground did not grow. It's a desolate land over the last 2,000 years, despite the fact that it was a flourishing land at the time of the Bible, right? Now, as the Jews returned in growing numbers, they decided that they were going to try to settle the land, and guess what? It worked, right? And dryland agriculture, advanced, forests were planted, and later Israel developed drip irrigation, right? Things like that, and methods of making the land come back to life. Very good with Jewish ingenuity, but this started happening beforehand. You talk about very poor Jews who were literally starving. Some of them had to leave the country because they were starving. But yet, the original settlers, when the return to the land in the late 1700s, early 1800s started, right? Despite the fact that there were many nations which tried to settle the land beforehand, they just never succeeded. But the Jewish people, with the same tools, they succeeded. And more recently, they had more scientific developments, which were invented by Jews, like drip irrigation, for example. Yeah, that's a Jewish invention. It's based in people trying to settle the land of Israel. Then the more desert, arid areas, right? Mark Twain, when he saw the land of Israel in the mid 1800s, right? He described parts of what was then called the region of Palestine, right? He said, a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. That's how he described it. That's what the land of Israel looked like. And for thousands of years, it's not as if people just let the land be ownless. It was owned by different countries, different empires. People try settling them. No success. Leave it. We can't make this land work. The Jews come in, suddenly it starts to flourish. So at the same time when the people come back, the land starts to flourish. It's very interesting. There's an idea of the green line. If you look from satellite images, it's really nice. If you look at the original state of Israel, as it's called, the 1949 borders, which is very small, you'll see that there's a lot of greenness on it, and then the border, which is like the West Bank, for example, see just over the border where the Jewish people were living in the land of Israel, over the border, not green. So that's called the green line. It's a well-known phenomenon, this, called the green line. You can actually see it. You can see where the vegetation goes still, where it stops, and then it's just barren again. Amazing. Right. Then you have this phenomenon of countries which go into exiles, or they change, they evolve, right? They modernize, right? They have a new language. Their language evolves to be whatever, either an updated version of the original language, or they just, abandon the language completely. So you have things like Latin evolved into many European languages, especially Spanish, right? Ultimately, the English comes mainly from Latin as well. Or you have Greek, ancient Greek. You don't really have ancient Greek anymore. You have like a more modern version, right? And but it's not as if someone reinstated that language. You had the Greeks from 2,500 years ago. The Greeks from 2,000 years ago, they're still speaking Greek. From 1,500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, they're still speaking Greek, and it evolved and it changed, and it became sort of, closer to the modern Greek language which we have today. When it comes to the Jewish people and their language, Hebrew or Aramaic, it completely stopped. Yeah, like with other languages, there were books, ancient books, like in Latin or ancient Greek. You still had those books which were studied, right? So we had the Talmud, we had the Torah, which was in Hebrew or Aramaic. So the languages were still there, but as a spoken language, we forgot it. The Jewish language is called Yiddish. Yiddish literally means Jewish, right? Yiddish is German essentially, with a few Hebrew words here and there, right? Right, I think it's 5% Hebrew words and sort of like 90% German, 5% other languages. Yeah, so the Jewish people had no problem having their own language, but yet when they come into the modern state of Israel, they resurrected the language, and they started to speak. Just speak Yiddish. It's much more clear. Everyone knows Yiddish. No, they want to make a new language for the land of Israel. They're going back to the original Hebrew, and they modernized it. Right, right. It's one thing to study ancient languages. There's another one to use it, to discuss with people things, to raise children, to joke, to quarrel, right? And build a modern society based on that language. It just doesn't happen, right? Languages evolve. They're not invented and taken on suddenly and then just adopted, right? Yeah, even Italians don't speak Latin in their homes. Yeah, they speak modern Italian, right? In India, Sanskrit is the ancient language they have there for their books of their religions and things like that. But yet no one speaks Sanskrit. They speak was it Hindi or other dialects there, right? So what happened? The Jewish people continued to pray and write and study and communicate in it, but it was not a normal language of the population. No one spoke Hebrew. But yet in the late 19th century, the Jewish people modernized it, and now millions of people speak Hebrew natively, right? Right. Okay, so the Jewish people, they got their language back. When does that ever happen? One example of a lost language, and there's loads of examples, several examples of ancient languages got lost. Ancient Greek, Latin, Old English, you could even say, Sanskrit, right? I'm not sure other countries what the history of their language is, but there's some good examples. And their languages stayed ancient, and we've just got modern versions of it. But Hebrew is basically the original Hebrew with all the syntax and everything, all the grammar, all the vocabulary, exactly as it was thousands of years ago, with the exception that there's new modern things, so you need a new word for them, right? Like aeroplane and things like that. Okay. Okay, number 9. People who are in exile may, for a few years, think, oh, we want to get back to our homeland. over the centuries, people, resign themselves, they accept the reality which they're in. I think, oh, that's a memory, like the African Americans. Yes, my ancestors 500 years ago from Nigeria or Ghana, or whatever, right? Yeah, we could trace it back through genes. I want to go back and live there. Maybe one or two people might think of that, but usually you're settled in another land. You're settled in another land. The memories fade, the languages change, right? Even usually borders change, so you don't even have the original country to go back to in the first place, right? People have new identities. So you do have some people going back to the original countries, but a substantial population reinstating the original ancient empire or country in the same place after 2,000 years? No, you don't get that even after a couple of hundred years, right? But the national memory of the country doesn't anymore need that country to define them. They've got their own communities, their own enclaves in their new countries, or they fully assimilate and they lose their identity. But you don't get people who have this constant yearning to go back, and they go back, and they succeed, and it's a new country. And in 1948, right, and even beforehand, to be honest, right, the Jews returned from Europe, North Africa, Middle East, literally as it says we're going to see, as it says in the prophets. Yeah, God says, I'm going to call to the east, or I can't remember the exact quote here. The east said, come, and from the west and say, come and repopulate the land. It's a prophecy, right? We're going to see the prophecy section soon, right? The Jewish people, right? We say next year in Yerushalayim, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. That's what we say every year at the end of the Haggadah and other times in the year, right? But it's a wish. But it's such a strong wish. The Jewish people actually realized it. So however you want to cut the cake here, whatever rational explanation you give, you're always going to have the problem. So what makes the Jewish people unique that they had, let's say, this conviction they have to get back to the land of Israel, despite 2,000 years in exile? Why does no other nation have this? And if they don't, right, which I don't think they have, right, then it's natural that a nation, after a short amount of time, 100 years, let's say 200 years, let's suggest, that they will never go back and reform their nation in the place where they used to be. Right? If they do, okay, it's going to be a short time. But never on this scale. We're talking about thousands of years and mass exile and dispersion of hundreds of different communities around the world. But yet they all have that magnet to the land of Israel, and they all come back eventually. There's no example of that. So that's an anomaly. Right? That doesn't follow nature. Either they're happy with where they are and they assimilate, but they don't hold out this desperate yearning to go back for thousands of years. What have I got to do with my ancestors 2,000 years? They went to exile. Okay, it's coming up to Tisha B'Av tonight. We're mourning the destruction of the temple. Quite appropriate to bring this in, right? And we're mourning. Every year we sit down on the ground, we read dirges, lamentations, right? We mourn, right? We don't eat. We're actually mourning, a national mourning every single year of the destruction of the temple and the exile which we're in now. We're not putting it down. Why does it, if this is a natural thing, this is not supernatural, then there should be many other nations which have such conviction for their original land. Or you could say, why should they? Why should I be mourning for something which happened 2,000 years ago? I'm quite happy in England or whatever, even if I'm not. Do what other people who are not happy in their country do. They try uprising, or they deal with it, or they move to a different country. Why do they feel that, I have to go to that original nation country which I was in originally. There are other stories of survival and restoration of a country, but there's no genuinely equivalent combination of duration, dispersion, right? 2,000 years, everywhere across the road, identity, Jewish identity changes. The core identity stays, right? But with English Jews, African Jews, Asian Jews, whatever the country happens to be, American Jews, yeah? Language, speaking different languages, different countries, different ideologies, right? Capitalists, communists, depending where they are, yeah? Whatever, royalists. Where do you get that? You don't get that from any other country. Not on that scale and that level of reasons why that wouldn't happen. All right. Finally, point number 10 is the premise is that if you have a small number of people in a country, they'll make a small contribution to that country, right? 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 So even though you can have certain cultures or education or wealth, yeah, or opportunity, they all contribute to the ability of a certain demographic in a country to contribute to the country. But the size of those people, the number of people in that demographic, will have a very significant effect on their effects of the country, of the contributions they put to the country. So for example, like so you might get Chinese people are meant to be hard workers, right? Or Koreans are known for their academic pursuits and their focus on academic not supremacy, academic idealism, right? They put emphasis on the importance of working hard and academic achievement. So you'd expect that a high proportion of Koreans or Chinese, when they go to different countries, that maybe they'll punch above their weight. So if they're 1% of the population, they might have a equivalent influence on the population, like 1.5%, maybe 2%, right? But remember, you're competing with a massive, like the rest of the country, like America or something, or it's not as an example America's because they've got a varied demographic anyway in the first place, right? But you think that like, the majority population there, the white population, I guess, who naturally, ancestrally are based on Greek philosophy and Roman, sophistication, things like that, they'll be the ones who naturally be the scientists. Whereas countries in other countries in the world, like the Arabic countries, they didn't put such an emphasis, with exceptions, the University of Sankor in Mali, right? There were philosophers and scientists amongst Arab countries, but that wasn't their focus. Their focus was their religion. Whereas Greek philosophy, the focus was intellectual pursuits. So you understand that will trickle down after centuries to the Europeans, and obviously in America you got the Europeans. So that's why you've got like a massive amount of inventions and things like that by people of white European descent, for example. Right? I'm being vague here, but don't get caught up on the different races or whatever. I'm just trying to bring out the idea. So people who are less than 1% of the population should not, by any ordinary sampling alone, repeatedly occupy an enormous share of technological and civilizational advances, right? If it's scientific, intellectual, cultural, even these are very different areas, right? So Jewish people have, for example, we use the Nobel Prize as some sort of a metric, as an indicator here. They have something like 25% of Nobel Prizes in science and mathematics and things like that. You can look up the proportions yourself. It's very easy to look up. But, I did a lot of preparation for this. I didn't manage to look up all the details though, because there are just so many details in each section. So, right, it's about a fifth to a quarter of Nobel laureates, right? And you're talking about 0.2% of the human, the human race, right? There was 15 million, so that's about 15 million out of 8 billion. That's 1 in 500. That's 0.2% of mankind are Jews. But yet, they are represented 100 times more than the population, right? And it's not just Nobel Prizes, right? Medicine, economics, literature, music, philosophy, technology, right? Law. It's a Jewish joke. There's a famous joke about the three women talking about their sons, right? And the first one says, "Oh, my son, the doctor," right? The three Jewish women, Jewish mothers. My son's a doctor. He's like in Harley Street, whatever, right? He's like the top physician there, right? And the other said, "Well, my son's like he's got his own law firm, and they deal with these big, they're on retainer for these big sort of multinational companies and everything." Right? Lawyers, each mother is very proud of their son, right? They look at the third and say, "What about your son?" I said, "See, he's a rabbi." I said, "That's not a job for a Jewish boy." Right? So that's the idea that for some reason Jewish people, when they're not being rabbis, they end up excelling in all different types of areas. What causes that? It's not just a few anomalies here and there. It's a complete sort of infiltration or massive overrepresentation of the Jewish people in these academic fields, the fields where they're creative and they help humanity, a light to the nation, right? Right. So a nation too small to register statistically, 0.2%, okay, has repeatedly altered statistics of civilization. Amazing. Right. Okay. So you see all these examples, right? Let's go through them once more very, very quickly. We spoke about to be a nation, to have a national identity, you need certain pillars: language, government, land. That's how all nations keep their identity, without exception. Even those enclaves we spoke about, they've still got something in common. They've got their language, right? They've got their language, or they've got their wherever their homeland is still there. So there's, we're from there. If their homeland disappears, then they are rootless. They start to lose their identity and become something new, not connected with their homeland because the homeland's gone. Whereas the Jewish people, we lost the homeland, and yet we still maintain Judaism exactly as it was thousands of years ago. Right? The very strange stagnation of the population. The Jewish people haven't grown despite having a very high birth rate, right, relative to other nations. But yet other nations overtake, they go into the tens of millions, right, hundreds of millions of some countries, right? But yet the Jewish people stay 15 million. They don't seem to go past that, right? not only do they not have a nation, they are scattered everywhere. That means they're not in sort of like big enclaves, big communities here, in about 10 different places in the world even. Not even, that would already be unusual, 10 significant communities of Jews. But despite lack of communication, right, throughout the last couple of thousand years, and the Jewish people have been scattered everywhere. That means tiny communities dotted everywhere in the world, right? So it's not like blocks here. It's like dots everywhere, right? With their little small communities, right? One here in the north of England, where I'm in Gateshead, a few hundred families, yeah, right? That's very small, about eight streets by 8 streets. That's it, right? We're scattered everywhere, but yet we keep our identity, right? That doesn't happen because usually, if you've got a big, significant area where you've taken over the area, then you can kind of survive that the influence of the cultures around you, right? But if you're so small and you know that you're just a tiny fraction, a fragment of the population which left, you tend to float into the assimilation like many Jews did, but yet you've got many communities which are now grown to be big communities, so they're kind of those larger enclaves now, like you have in England and definitely in New York and different places in America. But yet, different places, they've got tiny communities of just a handful of people, yet they still keep their Jewish identity. There's something else which is uniting them together. And if you say it's because of ideology, then you have to ask, why is no other ideology effective in making these other, their corresponding nations keep going despite complete dispersal over the whole world in tiny pockets, right? Very insignificant populations, right? Almost always less than 0.5% of the population in any country they go to. That means there's one Jew for 200 plus non-Jews. Yet they keep strong, they keep their identity. Amazing. The fact that the texts are preserved so well, right? No other text is preserved anywhere near as well as the 5 books, right? With literally one difference in all Torah scrolls, right? Versions, I should say. Until the Yemenites came along, then there's a handful, about 5, something like that, 6, right? But that's not how nature works. The natural law of preserving text does not work like that. Things get forgotten, right? Oh, sorry, things get miscopied, right? And eventually, like a game of telephone, more and more errors will creep in and creep in. One person says, hey, that's not right, that looks wrong. So he'll correct it. Sometimes he could be right, but he'll correct it to a third version, right? These things will go on and on. They'll deteriorate over time. But yet the Torah text, which is the Torah text, is 3,500 years old almost, still consistent. And that is with the added disadvantage of being dispersed and not having a common sort of forum where we could check, let's check the Yemenites 1,000 years ago, all the Jews of the world come together with an example of their Torah scrolls, they all compare them. That didn't happen. You had the Jews in Germany, the ones in Lithuania, they just kept their scrolls. No one compared scrolls with each other, right? You had in the Sephardic countries, the North African countries, in Syria, Syrian Jews, Middle Eastern, right, Iraqi, Persian, Yemenite and Arab countries, all over the world. They've got their own Torah scrolls, all exactly the same. And somehow, whatever the culture, disconnection, not able to communicate with any other significant group of Jews, right, or they just didn't, yet they still keep the consistency of the Torah scrolls. Right? Then we had the idea of the Jewish people is connected with that Nobel Prize thing a bit. Yeah, but this is the idea that the Jewish people, despite being a conquered nation, we have the opposite effect that a conquered nation would normally have. Usually a conquered nation assimilates to the larger culture, but yet we find that on a massive scale, not just a larger conquering country, empires change their philosophy to be more in line with the Jewish philosophy. Right? We said that Christianity and Islam are two massive examples. If you think about it, why on earth, if you think, okay, right, Muhammad saw some Jews, and thought, wow, that's good, monotheism, I like that. It could have just, and therefore spread, and it becomes a massive billion or 2 billion size religion now. It could have been anything. It could have been he decided Zoroastrian is the way to go, serve the fire god, or whatever, yeah? And let's go conquering the world, forcing everyone to convert to Zoroastrianism, or their own version of it, or whatever, right? Just so happens, when it came to Jews, he took monotheism, he was a successful one in spreading the religion over the world, right? Same thing happened with Christianity, yeah? It just happened. The Roman Empire, not the Scythians or the what's it called, the Carthaginians or whatever, they're not the ones who took on Judaism, it was the Romans, right? And the Romans were the ones who spread it over the whole world. So now basically most of the world believes in Judaism, ironically, right? Because more than half the world's population believes in some religion which at its source believes in the divinity of the Torah, right? Right? Then we had anti-Semitism, is that when one nation hates another group of people, it's usually for a consistent reason. It doesn't keep changing, right? And if it happens in one country, it won't happen in every single country that nation happens to be exiled to, right? And some countries will do fine, and some countries might have some persecutors, or they're just not liked, but they won't be hated, right? Yeah, and you combine that with the previous one, it makes it sort of a double whammy. The Jewish people, despite the fact that they were a minority, and were always a minority, and a very tiny minority, and we were hated, and yet still the nations took on our ideology and our philosophies, right? So that's just like put number 5 and 6 together. It's even more impressive, right? But the idea of anti-Semitism there, right? And then we said number 7, the fact that the land of Israel, so it's not the people now, it's talking about the land of Israel, seemed to be barren for thousands of years, and despite the fact that other people are trying to settle it, when the Jewish people come to settle it, it suddenly reacts. You don't get that in if you have a conquering nation goes into a land which is flourishing, you can usually, get it to be flourishing again. If you conquer an infertile land, you won't be able to suddenly make it fertile just because I'm Greek and not Roman or whatever, right? But yeah, when the Jewish people come in, it's like the land knew, oh, the Jews are here, let's start working again, which is exactly what it's prophesied in the text, as we'll see soon. Then we have the language, right? We never have an ancient language after, whether it evolved into more modern versions or it died out, right? We never have people going back to the original language. And that's exactly what happened with Ivrit, modern Hebrew. It's essentially exactly the same language, just with some added in modern words. So that, again, doesn't follow a pattern. Then we had the people, eventually the Jewish people returned to the land, right? Despite the fact that people, after a couple of hundred years maximum, they basically give up and they're happy with the new lands they happen to be settled in for an exiled country or nation, if they even survive in the first place and keep their identity. They'll keep their identity in the new land. They won't go out their way to go back to their conquered land. Usually it's much worse. The conquering nations are much nicer in terms of comfort and sophistication. So there's a rational pull to pull people into to stay in their new nations, and to go back to their old land. Very, very unusual. In fact, I don't think it's ever happened besides the Jewish people. Not on this mass scale. Right? Now the majority of Jews in the world, more or less, are in the land of Israel. So it's like we've gone back in time. And also the disproportionate influence that a tiny nation, however industrious or intelligent they are, there's no example where you have such a disproportionate effect on culture and advancement of civilization as the Jewish people have, to about 100 times overrepresented their population. A tiny population, probably the smallest nation in the world, right? 0.2% of the world's population, basically, but yet they have a huge effect on the world, right? And we mentioned right at the beginning, even Jews are no Jews, no news, as they say, yeah. And the whole world is now fixated on the Jewish people in Israel. What about the other massive conflicts? India and Pakistan should be blowing people's minds, yeah. Two nuclear powers at war with each other, yeah. And they should be saying, "Oh, what's going on there, right?" Or different genocides in different countries. Yeah, well, we're not about Israel being attacked by this tiny nation, right? Of 6 million people, or something like that, 7 million, I don't know, it might be even more now. It's growing quite quickly, right? The whole world's fixated on Israel, right? Amazing, right? Right. Let's step back a bit now. Each one of these historical events breaks a rule of nature, right? Some of them are much more blatant, some of them more debatable, right? All of them break it to a certain extent, right? Some of them absolutely astounding, like the preservation of the texts, for example. That's astounding. That makes zero sense. Yeah, because you can't control people making mistakes. You're saying every single scribe somehow had some sort of OCD to make sure he doesn't make a mistake. But when it comes to the Talmud, you don't say that. As scribes who copied the 5 books of Moses, they also copied the Talmud. The Talmud had loads of mistakes. Not loads, but a significant amount, as we mentioned before. Right? Inaccuracies, small one word here and there, sometimes a whole line missed out. Right? We're talking about huge volumes. A page is like about maybe 40 lines on the page, and very occasionally half a line can be missing, right? Usually on a page you get 3 or 4 words or a letter here or there, which has to be added in. Yeah? When it comes to the 5 books, near perfection, as you could ever hope, right? But now let's take a step back and look. We're not just talking about one example, right? Look at the whole picture as well. A nation loses its land, its sovereignty, its common speech, it survives, remains tiny, never disappears, scatters but remains one, right? And it's got loyalty and preserves its covenant, its religion, its deal it has with God, according to them, right? We're trying to be objective here, right? And their conquerors adopt their scriptures and adopt their ideologies, despite hating them, right? Right? And that hatred doesn't make sense because it seems that they've got a deep hatred for the Jews. They're just looking for excuses to say that we don't like them for reason A. Actually, well, we don't have reason A to hate them for. Let's see. They're different in this respect from us. Let's hate them for that. Right? The land revives, the language returns, the Jewish people go back to the land of Israel, and we have a massive influence in modern society. Each one of them is compelling. Once we do the natural versus not natural test. But it happens over and over again, 10 times, right? There's an 11th one which I thought of as well, the exile itself, which we're going to be mourning in a few hours. Usually countries are exiled or conquered by nations which are next to them, right? You can't imagine England being conquered by Germany. That's a bad example because that almost happened, right? You would imagine France would conquer Germany. Or, in the case of the Second World War, Germany conquered France and then it moved on to trying to conquer England. You wouldn't have Germany just going all the way through other countries and conquering England, which is exactly what happened at the destruction of the Second Temple. I think, well, maybe not so much. That's more to do with prophecy, I think. We'll leave that for prophecy lecture. Maybe it's not an 11th one. It's a different type of proof. Okay. One of prophecy. All right. You could, if you want to steel man the argument, we could say many of these reasons you could attribute to one comment. So it's not really 10 maybe. Yeah. Some of them can overlap sort of causally. Education. Let's say the Jewish people are very educated, very clever people, right? So they're very good at preserving their texts and achievement and contributing to society and maybe influencing the dominant culture, right? The land, the language. It won't explain why they wanted to restore their language, though, even though they could, right? But the fact is, if you look at each one of these separately, even more so as a conglomeration of different reasons, of different phenomenon, you simply do not have them with other nations besides the Jews. So however you want to cut it, if you want to look at 10 different things, so look at each one of these 10 things, it doesn't happen with other nations. No. Really, you can trace it down to 3 basic ideas. So why don't you have these 3 basic ideas in other nations? And to such an extent that it's got 5 different anomalies coming from this one reason. Right? So however you want to look at it, it doesn't fit with nature. Right? Of course, things have a rational reason to them. Right? Yeah, you can say, yes, the Jewish people contribute to the thing because they are very well educated. They have emphasis on education and academic prowess. Okay, that's the natural reason. But the question is, you've got to take a step back. Why is it only this nation that has such a high level of this? It's not just a bit greater than any other nation, it's way greater, right? The standard deviation of let's say, the population, let's say 0.2% of the population should have maximum, if they're very, very clever, let's take the IQ curve, let's say they're all geniuses. So they should have like a 0.6 times standard deviation, 3 times as much or something like that. I can't remember how the bell curve works. Yeah, let's say 3 standard deviations away from the average. Right? Let's say they're not just a bit clever, not just very, very clever. They're extremely more clever, like genius level more clever than anyone else. That's still only 3 times as much, right? So that you'd expect them to be 0.6%. Could be not accurate because people at the extremes tend to do better anyway. But okay, maybe that's a reason. But where do you get this nation? And this nation, where did they get its intelligence from? It's just genetic? Or just a fluke of nature that they're genetically more clever? Okay, we know that Jewish people do have an average IQ higher than most people, right? I think there was a study done or something where different races or religion, I think, show that Jewish people's IQ was a few points above the average. But we're not talking about levels where this should make such a difference that they're 100 times overrepresented. even if you say how they did it, let's say they are more clever, but why aren't other nations anywhere near this much clever? If it's a genetic thing, okay, so Jews are like that much clever than the average, and you should have this another country which is just lagging behind a bit, this one a bit less, but you've got the Jews, and then you've got other nations which are excellent, right? Chinese, Korean, whatever, yeah? Should be Jewish, Chinese, Korean, like that. Not, it doesn't work. And you can't say that this with all the anomalies, because all the anomalies, well, a lot of them contain things which you can attribute to Jewish people sort of pushing for a certain solution. You can't push anti-Semitism. You can't say, oh, I want people to hate us so we can show that we're different from all other nations, that people hate us no matter what we try to do. That's something which is done to them. So it's not something they are proactively doing. Okay? It's not as if the other ideologies or nations coordinated. Okay, we want there to be a proof of the divinity of Judaism, so we want the Jews to be hated for completely irrational reasons. Okay, so you hate them for this reason, this country hate for that reason. Oh wow, okay, we've got an anomaly now. You can't say it's contrived. The reasons for Jewish uniqueness are contrived when it's being done to them. That's too much of a conspiracy theory. And even the ones where the Jewish people themselves do it, it doesn't work. Because naturally these things don't happen like that. Okay. So essentially what we're saying is there are only two possible categories of cause. Right? If you look at it, okay, they're more intelligent, they're cleverer, they're more persistent, they're more rigorous, okay. But we're not just looking at those individual reasons, we're looking at it as in terms of patterns of history. In history, is there a nation which is so determined that it converts their conquerors into their own ideology? Is there a pattern in history where we see this happening even on a small scale, or preservation of text? Do we see it happening as a natural thing? If it's natural, all the Jewish people, if they can achieve near perfection of the preservation of texts, there must be a few other nations which get pretty close to that. Okay, maybe 100 errors in their special books, right? Yeah, that's acceptable. But you don't. You talk about thousands of inaccuracies in cultures which their books are, central to them, and yet they have the power to make sure that things don't deteriorate, right? And yet the Jewish people, everything's the opposite. Yeah, you bet against them in so many areas, but yet they thrive. So is this natural? If it's natural, it should happen with other nations. This is the simple argument here. If it isn't natural, then why don't we have it repeated in many nations, at least in a few? And it just so happens, okay, let's say it's a one-off. It's a one-off. They happen to be very good scribes. But it got a one-off in terms of not being able to increase their population. And the same nation, and another anomaly just so happens to be with the Jewish people, and another anomaly, it's the Jewish people again, right? You have anomalies, and they all seem to happen with the same nation, over and over again. That is not natural. So either it's natural or it's not natural. So I'm positing to you today that something is either natural or not natural, and these phenomenon, you can maybe argue with one or two of them on the isolated level, but all 10, that's too much. That's a preponderance of evidence. That's every time we bring an example, it pushes us more and more and more to the side where yeah, it's not natural. There's something going on here. One or two already, it's very hard to say that you can have a natural explanation for such a difference. But 10, all with the same nation? That's way too much. So if something is not natural, what's the other option? It must be, I mean, remember what's nature? Nature is things which run by repetition and rules, and there are laws of nature, fixed laws, which project themselves onto things which happen in this world, right? Whether it's things falling down the whole time, whether it's people selling objects cheaper when there's more objects to sell, or whether it's nations which go into exile, assimilating or being wiped out, or nations not being able to preserve perfectly their texts, or at least not near perfectly, right? It's natural for all these things to happen. But yet, if it doesn't happen with one nation, and only one nation, if it happened with 20 nations, then okay, fine. So you have to explain that. There's a dual nature. There's a nature that most things happen like this, and a minority happens like that. That itself is strange. But for one nation only to not fit in with the natural order of things tells us that the thing which caused this is something which is not nature. By definition, it's supernature. It's supernatural, above nature. So an anomaly points to a hidden cause which not only you can't explain naturally, it doesn't matter if you come up with an explanation, because by virtue of it not repeating itself ever in any other nation, that itself tells us you cannot find a natural explanation, i.e. an explanation which repeats itself. But if the world is formed in such a way where there's certain laws and rules which repeat, then the Jewish people show there's something beyond that system. There has to be. There has to be something beyond the system of nature. Because if it's in nature, nature didn't pick the Jewish people as an exception. That's not nature anymore. It's not repetitive. Right? You can't, if it would be repeated itself, there'd be another nation which preserves its text, another nation which has an influence on its conquerors. Right? Even though there might not be many examples to draw from, but you never see it. You never see this. Right? So again, by virtue of the fact that it's not repeated, shows that it's not something which is caused by laws of nature. So therefore, something outside of nature has to be causing these things to happen, these anomalies to happen. Okay. Let's have a look at some verses, actually. So we would say that's God. God, our definition of God, part of our definition of God, is something which is above nature, something which is outside nature, something which creates nature, but he himself is not limited by nature. Yeah, we said he's above time, right? He creates time, right? The way that the Big Bang model, which everyone accepts nowadays, works, is you have a beginning to time, right? And the laws of nature are already in their form at the Big Bang, right? And it's just like things act differently when there's massive density and heat, but when things spread out, then you see the laws of nature acting in the way where they would now, right? Because otherwise they'll work in ways of plasma as opposed to gases and liquids, etc., right? Formation of atoms into molecules. Yeah, that's how nature works. Nature starts from the Big Bang, right? Which is the genesis, if you want to use that word, or the origin of the universe. So there has to be something beyond the origin of the universe. That means you're saying that there is a force which brought the universe with its laws of nature into being. That's a proof of God based on the fact that there's essentially miracles. But these are not just miracles which you can explain by a one-off fluke. These are persistent miracles which happen throughout time. The Jewish people, anti-Semitism wasn't just a one-off where people hated them for two different reasons. It wasn't just 3 or 4. It was hundreds of different reasons. Yeah, if you look at our anti-Semitism lecture, you see the massive list there of anti-Semitism which happened in different countries around the world, and many of them we showed different reasons, different rational reasons for, but that itself is not rational because that doesn't happen. There's no nation where people have many reasons why people hate them. Right? It's usually down to 1 or 2. Either they're too big for their boots, right? Or they cause crime, or they are isolated, or they try assimilating too well and taking over the institutions of the country, right? But either way, only if that's the nature of that people, they'll fall into that category of hatred. You won't get all of them though. But not only does this prove, when we say prove, we mean overwhelming evidence, and based on this idea that something's either natural or not natural, or supernatural. Not only does it show us that there's a power which transcends nature, the fact that there's things in this world which are not natural, and not just one-off miracles, but things which are, it's like this power is constantly involved in interfering with nature. The fact that Jewish people are constantly the same population, or more or less not growing, or constantly being able to somehow preserve their text near perfectly without a printing press or photocopying or anything. Now let's have a look at the Torah, right? So this is astonishing in itself, the fact that all these anomalies can happen in the first place. But imagine if someone predicted these things before it happened. So let's have a look. Look in Deuteronomy 28:64 when it speaks about the exile. Right? God will scatter you amongst all the peoples, all the nations, from one end of the earth to the other. This is not a prediction which normally happens, right? You can have of course, you can have a country which is conquered and its people are put into exile. Where'd they go? To the next country, or 2 countries over, right? Or in this direction towards the west. You don't get a country which is in exile and it gets scattered all the nations of the world. And if you have a look, I looked up once that there's Jews in every country in the world. There are Jews, despite their tiny numbers. I think besides maybe a few very small nations might not, right? But anything which is a recognizable country of like a few 100,000 people, you'll get Jews in them, even just a handful. But all over the world, right, as it says in the verse, right, amongst all the peoples, from one end of the earth to the other, all the way from Russia, all the way to America in the west, Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Chile, right, in the southwest, Australia, New Zealand, right, India, Japan, Korea, I'm not sure actually. Okay, that's a good one to look up. I think there might be. All right, okay, whatever. Okay, think of any country, Indian Jews, right? That's one of the big ones. There used to be big communities in India, right? So it was not this global scattering where a nation goes into exile and And it's scattered not just in one or two enclaves, they're dispersed everywhere in very small groups relative to the whole nation, was predicted, right? What about that claim that we said that the Jewish people will be always a small population, 15 million, despite the fact we should be in the billions already. And with our birth rate, we should be like, I would say at least 2-3 billion, right? We should be, right? If we weren't persecuted, right? The Torah provides a verse saying, right? Or the verse says, you'll be left as a very small number, instead of being like the stars, as many as the stars, right? Okay, where was an expression there, right? And it says in Deuteronomy, let's look it up. I'm actually going to read it in the Torah reading tomorrow on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. It's one of the very sad passages talking about, one of the few passages speaking about the exile from the land. It says, "Ve'ifitz Hashem eschem bo'amim," and God will scatter you amongst the nations. V'nishartem mesem mispor, and you will remain a small number. That means you won't dwindle and get smaller. Nishartem, you'll stay. You won't die out. But mesem mispor, not because your population will grow because of your high birth rate, and that will give you stability amongst nations. No, you'll always be in a state of natural deterioration and danger of extinction, but you'll stay like that, don't worry. You'll be surrounded by people who want to kill you and destroy you. Don't worry, you'll stay, you'll be fine. Yeah, you'll never be powerful in exile, right? Yeah, you'll still be vulnerable to the surrounding nations, right? Because you'll still be a tiny minority in each country, open to the whims and wills of any anti-Semites who want to have a go at you, right? But you'll still remain, right? But you'll remain not because you increase in numbers and have some sort of political power and strength. You remain because I'm going to look after you, right? The same mispar, and a small number. That's in actually tomorrow's Torah reading, and we can read it again on the Sabbath. It's this week's portion of V'eschanan. Also, at the end of V'eschanan, Deuteronomy chapter 6, I think. Where is it? Is it chapter 7? Yeah. Yeah, if you look at chapter 7, it's a much nicer chapter, right? Right. You are a holy nation to the Lord your God. This is chapter 7, verse 6 in Deuteronomy. Right? God chose you to be his treasured nation, his chosen nation. Mikol Amim, from all the nations, Asher Pnei Adamah, which are on the face of the earth. Not because you are more or numerous than the other nations, right? Did God choose you? That you're the big nation, like the Roman Empire, right? You're going to spread my word nice and good, right? Or the Arab nations, right? They're going to spread my word. No, I'm not picking you because you're useful, because you can spread it. Ka'atem hama'at mikol ha'amim, because you're the smallest of all the nations. Maybe that's referring to the 70 nations, with the smallest of the 70 nations. Nowadays, I think there's more Jews in some of the, there's more Jews in the world than in Luxembourg, for example. But in terms of the Torah's definition, we are the smallest of all the nations, the 70 nations. We are the smallest one, right? So this is all predicted by the Torah. We saw a few verses there. We will remain small. We are a small nation, and we will remain small in numbers, but not in our influence. That's something else. right? You have a look in Parshas Nitzavim, which is no, not Nitzavim. This is the first time the Torah speaks about the curses and the tragedies of exile. One is chapter 26 in Leviticus, the other one's chapter 28 in Deuteronomy. So in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 32, right, it says, 31, we'll start from there. And I'll make your cities desolate, and I'll destroy your holy place, right? And I will not smell, so to speak, the smells of your basically the sacrifices. You won't have a temple to offer the sacrifices, animal sacrifices, the flower sacrifices anymore. This is verse 32, right? And I will destroy the land, and your enemies will be astounded by it. Like we quoted Mark Twain before, right? It's just a broken, desolate, sad land or something like that. Right? And the nations will be astonished. Your enemies will be astonished. That means the conquerors. They'll go, oh, look at this Jewish land. It's just desolate here. Right? The ones who dwell in it, who live in it. They say, what's with that? The Jewish people succeeded in this land? This is uninhabitable. Incredible. It's predicting that the people who live in the land of Israel will not be able to understand how the Jewish people can lived in this land, as at that time it will be completely desolate, and presumably they're not able to get it to work again. Right? And again, there's another verse, and I will spread you amongst the nations, and people chase after you, trying to kill you, and your cities will remain desolate. Right? Okay. So another verse. Another verse in Deuteronomy chapter 28, I think. Look it up. No, not 28. What am I talking about? 29. 29, yeah. Yeah. Right. And the later generation shall say, this is chapter 29, verses 21 to 24. Right? And the later generations, your children, is speaking to the Jewish people here, which will come after you, and the non-Jewish will come from a far land. Is there a farther land than America? Mark Twain, who came to the land of Israel. You'll see the afflictions of this land and its illnesses, which Hashem has afflicted them with it. That's interesting. I'm just trying to look up that quote again from a hopeless, dreary, heartbroken land. That was the words of Mark Twain there. Yeah. Right. So again, we've got verses which say, sulfur and salt burnt up the whole land. It cannot be planted. It will not be plantable, right? And it cannot produce anything. And no grass will even grow on it. Just like the overturning and destruction of the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? 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 That means the destruction of the land of Israel will be so absolute that nothing can grow there. And all the nations who see this will say, for what reason did God do this to this land? What is this great fury? And it carries on and says, because they abandoned God and His Torah and the covenant, right? And then it says, and God brought the curses on that land. Okay, fine. Right, again, prophesied dispersal, exile, staying constant in numbers, a small nation, and destruction of the land. Right? Right? But yet the Jewish people will persist and survive despite all the adversity they face, right? So Jeremiah, I'm going to just quote the English now. Yeah, only if the order of the sun, the moon, and the stars cease will the Jewish people cease to be a nation in front of God. That means the national existence of the Jewish people is compared to the reliability of the sun, moon, and stars. That means nature, right? If the Jewish people cease to exist, then nature will cease to exist. That's saying that no, that if you think there's such a thing as nature, right, and because of nature the Jewish people should theoretically be destroyed, no. Yeah, the only way it's me who does nature. I'm the one who's saying the Jewish people will survive and flourish, right? Right, so it's saying the Jewish people will always survive despite the fact that naturally we should have died out, been destroyed, at least maybe not biologically, but at least the ideals and the Torah and the continuation of the nation's Jewish people, what we represent, should have gone. So no, the Jewish people will always exist. And we'll finish off in the next chapter, chapter 30. It's a beautiful chapter. Right, chapter 30 in Deuteronomy. When all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I've put in front of you, and you shall return to your heart amongst the nations. That means you repent. Which Hashem has pushed you there. And you shall return to God and you should hear His voice, right, etc. And God will return your exiles. And he'll come and he'll carry you from all the nations, which God has gathered, has dispersed you there. If you've been dispersed and exiled to the ends of the heavens, God will take you even from there. And he'll bring you back to the land, not just to a national land where you can all be together again, which your ancestors, the patriarchs, inherited, and he will do good to you, right? More numerous than your fathers, right? And of course you to do teshuvah and repentance. Okay, beautiful. Okay, so we see from there as well, right? There's another one of the proofs. I think I had a verse 4. Let me think. Yeah, also this week's Torah portion, verse Chana, which again we're reading this Sabbath. This one maybe not so clear, but I think it's a good reference. In Deuteronomy again, chapter 4, verses 6 to 8. And you should guard them, referring to the Torah and the commandments, you should do them, because this is your wisdom in the eyes of the nations. It's not just a wise thing to do. The non-Jews will recognize the wisdom of the laws of the Torah and the commandments, even though they don't keep the Torah and the commandments. They'll recognize the wisdom. Because they'll hear all these statutes, these laws. Only such a wise nation, only this great nation is a wise and understanding people, right? Just taking the translation there, would have translated a bit differently, but yeah, only such a nation can be so wise, to have such wise commands. Well, they come from God, it's not us, right? Because who is a great nation which God is close to, all are calling him, and who is a great nation who has righteous laws and statutes, like all of this Torah, which God says, which I'm giving to you today. So again, the idea of the non-Jews looking up to the Jewish people and the philosophy and the Torah and the mitzvahs, the commandments, all predicted there in the Torah. So even though each one of these individual phenomena does not recur in any other nation, and therefore it's supernatural, but not only that, this being which we've demonstrated transcends nature and can interfere with nature, he actually predicted it. He told us this was going to happen beforehand. So he's above time, or he's just very confident that this being is going to make sure it does happen. But from our point of view, this was predicted. So it's a being which is above time, right? Unless you say, which we also believe, that God manipulates every detail of creation even after he's created it. So you could say that maybe you can't prove from here that God's above time, just basically based on prophecy, because you can say that, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because God said it will happen, so therefore I'm going to make sure it happens because I'm all powerful. So you could say it that way. Either way, you've proved that there's a God which is powerful enough to make history follow his rule. Okay. So now we've got a double-barreled set of proofs, right? So even without prophecy, the persistent anomalies all point to this non-natural or supernatural intervention, right? Centered upon one people. It's a very strong argument to say that there is such a thing as God. Our definition of God, at least part of it, is a being which is above nature, and nature is just his creation. Therefore, he can, if he chooses, he can still interfere with creation, with nature. He can override nature if he wants to, right? Either in an open way or a more hidden way, where he does things sort of with natural reasons, but they don't follow any other pattern. So this is what we would call a hidden miracle, something which doesn't follow the pattern of nature, but it's done in such a way where it doesn't, like, oh wow, the car's starting to dance, right? And like doing, somersaults, right? And giving me a thumbs up. A car, how can a car do that? That's an open miracle, right? But here, the fact that a nation doesn't get killed, okay, people survive, right? But the way it happens doesn't fit in with any other patterns in nature. Then on top of that, the Torah describes it beforehand and predicts it, right? And that shows us either intelligence, intention, or power, right? Control. And this shows a few things. It shows there is a being which is above nature, one which is involved in nature even after the creation, one who seems to be more powerful than nature, right? Possibly we can even show that he's above time, right? Above concepts. If you remember our second video on the channel about who or what is God, you'll hear all these different things which we expressed as the fundamentals of the Jewish understanding of what God is, right? We said he's one, he's not physical, that means he's above the physical world, above nature. He's before time, right? Right? And some of the later ones we didn't speak about, the fact that he communicates with the world, he interferes with the world, right? He directs the world. Okay? The fact that this is written in the Torah indicates to us that this is indeed God writing it, because God, whoever wrote the Torah, it's definitely not a human. A human doesn't have the ability to know the future. Right, physically, a human wrote it down, but it has to be a prophet who got this information from God. So God's the one who told us that this will happen. He said, this will happen because I'm going to make sure it happens. And in fact, I'm above time. I know, from my point of view, it has happened. If you want to put both those truths into it, yeah, they're both true. But the Torah is the thing which speaks out what will happen in the future. So the Torah is God's book now. So now we've proved God, we've proved the divinity of the Torah, and we've proved that the Jewish people have a special providence. God is directly interfering with the Jewish people, guiding his people to do his job, which he wants achieved in this world. But the Jewish people are God's messengers in this world. So therefore, he said, I'm going to take direct care of you, and I don't care about the laws of nature. Other nations, I'll look after them as well, but I'm not going to do it so openly. I'm not going to change laws of nature. There's a nature, just like there's a nature, rain falls from the sky and hits the ground, right? Gravity, all the other things, cause and effect, economic laws, psychological laws, like we all spoke about earlier, right? I want the world to run by laws. In fact, that's one of God's names, Elohim, like we mentioned earlier, which is the name representing God's acting in a hidden way through nature. Don't think of nature as happening by itself. It's God acting. It's just he's doing it in such a way where you can make the mistake of thinking it happens by itself. That's the test of this world. Our job is to say Hashem hu Elohim. God is Elohim. This Elohim, this natural way that the world seems to work, it's Hashem. It's God himself who's doing it. There's no two different gods. That transcendent God is the one who's manipulating nature. He wants the world to work through nature. And therefore, when it comes to running the nations, there's laws, right? A big nation conquers a small one. The small one assimilates, right? It's very hard for small nations to exist independently within another nation and not assimilate and keep their identity, and definitely not go back to the original land and things like that. That's all nature. For whatever reason, God wanted that to happen. That's natural. For the Jews, no, you've got a specific purpose here, and I'm going to make sure it happens in a way which shows that your job is more connected with the supernatural aspect of creation rather than the natural one. So therefore, I'm going to make your existence and your survival supernatural. Okay? Which is very nice, because we spoke about before the different jobs of the Jews and the non-Jews. Jews are the ones who are meant to bring the spiritual, the transcendent into the world, and the non-Jews' job is the one to settle, to formulate the physical world, the world of nature, so it's a moral, ethical world where you can now have God come in and express his holiness in the physical world, right? Because every spiritual thing needs a physical vessel to express itself through. And in terms of God, that's God expressing himself through the whole universe. So the job of the non-Jews is to make the physical world that vessel. So it's very nice, right? So God treats people in the same way that corresponding to their job. For the Jews, he wants them to be the supernatural, the nation which brings a supernatural element of reality in, bring God's spirituality into the world. So therefore God treats them like for like supernaturally. And in fact, talk about Tisha B'Av coming up tonight. Yeah, it says that the Jewish people, when we're high, we're higher than any other nation, but when we're lower than all the nations. When we're successful, we're the most successful nation. But when we're suffering and when we abandon God, God forbid, and needs to bring destruction to us, we don't just fall down to be a regular conquered nation. We really go into the depths. Look at the Holocaust as a recent example. Absolute tragedy of human suffering and evil and persecution, right? It's just evil, right? Or we can even look at the October the 7th attacks, but the inhuman sort of desecrations of what it is to be a human being they did to, yeah, we all know. And that's what we're mourning today on Tisha B'Av, the destruction of the temple and the beginning of this long, bitter exile, where you got all this anti-Semitism. God says, no, but this is part of the plan. You're going to exist not in a natural state. You're either going to be supernatural this way or you're going to be supernatural that way, supernaturally despised, supernaturally persecuted, right? Your job is to be supernatural, to bring the supernatural in. So you have to show supernaturality. That's who you are. The non-Jews, natural. So therefore, the laws of successful nations and failed nations follow patterns because their job is to establish the physical, natural world. Nice idea. And the Torah is essentially the signature, God's signature, God's will. This is me revealing what's going to happen in the world. This is me revealing I'm the one in charge. I'm going to predict everything. Okay. Okay. A few quotes here at the end here. Let's finish off with the quote from of Mark Twain. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. In nature, things grow from a small thing, they increase, they become strong, and then they die down and wither out. The Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, these are huge empires which conquered the whole known world. The Persian Empire, where are they now? Where's Persia? Iran country. In their history, they're proud of their Persian history. But where's that empire gone? Where's the Greek Empire? It's a small country now. There's a lot of amazing relics and archaeology and stuff like that, and all these temples and stuff. Beautiful stuff that they got there to remember what they used to be. Where is it now? Look at the Romans. They conquered England, right? Hadrian destroyed one of the 5 things which happened on Tisha B'Av. So Hadrian destroyed the town of Beitar, right? One of the 5 tragedies. We spoke about this in last year's lecture about the 5 things which happened on the 17th of Tammuz, the 5 things which happened on the 9th of Av, the 2 sets of 5. Listen to that now if you can. Very, very deep, very profound. What we're actually mourning. One of the things is that Hadrian destroyed the idea of there'll be a Mashiach, there'll be a Messiah coming soon. What happened? Ben Koziva, Bar Kochba, right? He led the rebellion against Beta, which even Rabbi Akiva thought, oh, he's showing all the signs of the Messiah. Then he gets killed. And that dashed the hopes of the Jewish people of having a quick Messiah. Now we're waiting 2,000 years for it. Hopefully coming very soon. Hopefully this will be one of the last times we mourn on Tisha B'Av. Let's hope things are hotting up in the Persian Gulf as predicted, as we mentioned on that Armageddon lectures. Yeah. All these nations, they come and they go. The Spanish Empire, right? Persecuted the Jews. The Inquisition, gone. Just another country now getting overrun by people from other countries. Nations rise, they fall. The Jewish people are there, small. They're still small. They're still small. They persist. They survive. They do their job. Then their ideology, not them, their ideology, they bring God into the world. They bring God into the world, the knowledge of God, the knowledge of monotheism, they bring it into the world, and they still remain small. That's not natural. Yeah? That's supernatural. The supernatural people with a supernatural job. Thanks for watching.